Now, by one credible source, there are over 300 human rights reports on what happened in Gaza, and all the major human rights organizations and uh, investigations, the Goldstone Report, the Dugard Report, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and so forth, they all investigate the allegation of human shielding by Hamas. So if I were to ask either of the two women who are busily taking notes, what is the most reputable human rights organization in the world, you would say, yeah, Amnesty International is usually the one that people name. So Amnesty International did do an intensive investigation in the question of human shielding, and this is what Amnesty concluded. Contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. It just didn't happen. Now here's the more interesting question. I asked how many of you are aware of the allegation that Hamas engaged in human shielding, and virtually everybody in the room raised his or her hand. Now, how many of you were aware, speaking honestly, candidly, and forthrightly, how many of you are aware that all the human rights organizations that investigated the question came to the same conclusion, that it didn't happen? So raise your hand. Now look around you. It's worth looking. There's about 4 people. This is Oxford. And this is an audience which is more than averagely interested in the topic. And also, incidentally, and not so incidentally, an audience which is almost certainly overwhelmingly sympathetic to the Palestinians. And even here, just a tiny, tiny handful of people know the basic facts. That the issue, the claim, the allegation of human shielding was, so far as one can tell from all the human rights organizations, it simply was untrue. Amnesty International went one step further. It said even if it were true that Hamas had engaged in human shielding, and they said there's no evidence to support that allegation, even if it were true, it couldn't explain all the deaths in Gaza. Well, why not? Well, here's what Amnesty said. In the attacks that caused the greatest number of fatalities and injuries, the Palestinian victims were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces, nor were the Palestinian victims shielding militants or other legitimate targets. So they weren't caught in the crossfire between the Israelis and Hamas. They weren't being used as human shields. How did those 1,400 Palestinians perish? Amnesty said many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. How did the 400 children die in Gaza? The 400 children prematurely dispatched to their maker. How did they die? Amnesty said the children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. All the human rights organizations concluded that Israel had committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity. They all concluded that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but on an incomparably smaller scale. After all, how many crimes can ants commit against a child, incinerating them with a magnifying glass? After 22 days, Israel withdrew from most of Gaza. Now, afterwards, much of the news reportage, the critical news reportage, that said that Israel had fired indiscriminately, haphazardly in Gaza. But that wasn't entirely true. In fact, a lot of the assault in Gaza was quite discriminate and very far from haphazard, because Israel wanted to make sure that after it left Gaza, life would be more miserable for the people there than before it invaded Gaza. So, for example, in Gaza there was only one operative flour mill left. It was the El Badr flour mill. And during the assault in Gaza, Israel destroyed the El Badr flour mill to deprive the Palestinians of their only staple. In Gaza, there were 22 ready-mix cement factories. Of those there were 29 ready-mix cement factories. Of those 29, Israel carefully targeted 22. Why? Because it wanted to make sure after it withdrew, the Palestinians couldn't rebuild from the destruction. And there was quite a lot to rebuild. There were 600,000 tons of rubble left behind when Israel withdrew from Gaza. About a year and a half later, the whole issue of what was going on in Gaza became a topic of note, and Israel claimed that there was no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that this has all been vastly exaggerated, the condition of the people in Gaza. The international human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations at that point stepped in. They said Israel was not accurately reporting what's going on in Gaza. Oxfam, the humanitarian organization, had said, contrary to what the Israeli government states, the humanitarian aid allowed into Gaza is only a fraction of what is needed to answer the enormous needs of an exhausted people. The World Health Organization said Israel is blocking vital medical supplies from entering the Gaza Strip. The International Committee of the Red Cross has said the blockade is having a devastating impact on the 1.5 million people living in Gaza. And then at this point, a kind of strange debate unfolded in the media and in the public square. On the one hand, Israel was saying, well, conditions are not so bad in Gaza. We've put the people of Gaza on a starvation plus diet. So it wasn't so dire, it was starvation plus. The international humanitarian and human rights organizations, they said not so. Israel has put the people of Gaza on a starvation diet. And amidst this debate, it seems to me the most fundamental point was obscured, namely, what right did Israel have to put the people of Gaza on any diet? Even Israel's harshest critics, they did agree with Israel on one point. And the one point was, they said, Israel does have the right to prevent weapons from going to Gaza. But that's not entirely clear. One of the world's leading authorities, but I think he's at Oxford or he could be at Cambridge, I'm not sure, so somebody in the audience can correct me. His name is James Crawford. Is he at Oxford or Cambridge? Anyone know? Well, he's the author of this humongous tome called The Creation of States Under International Law. It's a monster book. I had to read it 50 pages at a time, usually between 1 and 4 a.m. It was very rough going. That fellow must read in his sleep, given the range of his references. But he says the international law is neutral on the question of whether or not a people struggling for self-determination have the right to use armed force. And if they have the right to use armed force, then as B follows from A, they obviously have the right to receive weapons to use armed force to resist or to acquire their right to self-determination. Now, some of you might be thinking, and fair enough, you're thinking, well, we didn't come here to talk about armed force, we didn't come here to talk about violence. We want peace, we want to reach a settlement of this conflict, and that's, as I said, I can perfectly well sympathize with that. But even if you're of that mindset, Still, what even Israel's harshest critics were saying was completely hypocritical, because the basic facts are these. As Amnesty International pointed out in its report Fueling Conflict, which it released right after the attack on Gaza, Amnesty said under international law it's illegal to transfer weapons to any consistent violator of human rights. And Amnesty International said yes, Hamas is a consistent violator of human rights, so it's illegal to transfer weapons to Hamas. But Amnesty International said Israel's also a consistent violator of human rights, and it's illegal to transfer weapons to Israel. And so Amnesty said there has to be a total comprehensive arms embargo on all parties to the conflict. Now, to the extent that the international community, even Israel's harshest critics, they said Israel had the right to prevent weapons going to Gaza, but didn't also say that we have an obligation to prevent weapons from going to Israel, it was completely hypocritical. In any event, as everybody in this room knows, on May 31st, a flotilla attempted to break the illegal blockade of Gaza, that flagrant violation of international law, which was destroying a civilization. And Israel launched an attack on the flotilla, in particular the flagship, the Mavi Marmara. We'll probably never know what happened on that fateful morning, the exact sequence of events, although now we have, I think, a reasonably accurate picture. It's not definitive, but certainly seems quite credible. The Human Rights Council at the UN, which I'll make no brief for, I think it's completely unserious, contemptible, actually. But it's also true to say that when the Human Rights Council appoints investigative commissions, it generally chooses people of very high repute and distinction. And so in the case of Gaza, it chose Richard Goldstone, and also the panel it appointed to investigate what happened in the Mavi Marmara. It was a very credible panel of experts in international law. And they released a report. Time doesn't allow me to go into the details, but the essentials go something like this. They say that Israel began the assault on the Mavi Marmara with the Zodiacs, the inflatable boats, and they used stun grenades or percussion bombs, tear gas, and plastic bullets. After that initial assault was repelled, then they say Israel sent in the helicopters, and they say that Israel began using live ammunition before any Israeli commando hit the deck of the Mavi Marmara. Israel was already using live ammunition against the passengers on the Mavi Marmara before any commando had rappelled on the deck. By the end of the assault, 9 passengers in the Mavi Marmara were dead. According to these jurists, these respected jurists, 6 of the 9 passengers died as a result, and now I'm quoting the report, of summary execution, which is to say, in layperson's language, 6 of the 9 passengers were murdered in cold blood. In any case, the exact sequence of events is not really of major importance because everybody here is familiar with the basic facts, and the basic facts decide the fundamental legal question. The basic facts are, number 1, Israel was imposing an illegal blockade of Gaza, a flagrant violation of international law because it was a form of collective punishment against the civilian population. Number 2, this illegal blockade of Gaza was